Hi, I'm Kathy with the Delafield Quilt Company, and today I'm going to show you how to do a real easy machine sewn binding. I hope you enjoy the tutorial. Okay, to bind your quilt, you're going to need to first figure out how big your quilt is. So I know that my quilt is 36 inches on each side. And then you're going to need some fabric, 2.5-inch strips, that is enough to make it around your quilt perimeter plus 12 inches. It's also helpful to have some binding clips. You're going to need your rotary cutter and a nice long ruler for trimming up the edges of the quilt. So first, let's start by trimming up the edges of the quilt. To do that, I'm just going to open it up fully. Then I'm going to take my long ruler and I am going to square up the edges, and I'm going to just trim off this excess batting and the backing. And use the marks on your ruler to help square up the edges of your quilt. Sometimes after the quilting process you'll find that your fabric shifts a little bit, but squaring up just kind of helps correct that. And in case you're wondering about this quilt, the blocks on this quilt were made using the log cabin courthouse steps, and we do have a video on our channel if you want to check that out. And then the next step is to sew your pieces together, and you're going to want to sew diagonally starting from the left top down to the bottom right. And if it's helpful, you could use a ruler to draw that diagonal line. You can pin it together if you like, and then you're just going to sew right on this diagonal line. And then once you have it sewn together, you're just going to trim about 1/4 inch away from where you just sewed. And if you want it, you could press the seams open as well, and I am going to go ahead and do that. Okay, once you have all your strips sewn together, you're going to then press it in half the long ways. And you're going to want to use your iron to do this. So I'm going to go press it and I'll be right back. Okay, now that I've got the binding strips all folded in half and pressed, I'm ready to attach this to the top of the quilt. So you could really sew this on either side of the quilt. I'm going to choose to do the top because when I roll it over, I want that rolled edge showing on this side. And then as you'll see later, on the other side, you'll be able to see the stitching. So I'm going to start with the front, and then I'm going to take the raw edge and line it up with the raw edge of the quilt. And I want to leave myself at least 6 inches before I'm going to start sewing. And then I'm just going to clip it in a few places. I'm only going to do one side at a time. And then when I sew it, I'm going to start probably down about here on the second clip, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance along the side. And then I want to stop 1/4 inch before I get to the edge of the quilt. When I do that, I am going to turn it and sew diagonally to the corner, and I'll show you that in a second. Again, when you're getting ready to sew, just make sure you leave at least 6 inches at the top. And then we're going to do 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to stop 1/4 inch from the corner. And I'm just going to slow down before I get to that 1/4 inch mark. And once I've gotten there, I'm going to leave my needle down, turn it so that the corner is now in that center path of the needle. And I'm just going to sew straight to the corner. Cut your threads. Okay, now you can see that I have a diagonal to the corner. And then I'm just going to fold the binding strip over that so that we have a diagonal here, and then I'm going to go back over, and that's going to create that nice mitered edge when you turn the binding around the quilt. So now same thing on this side, except I don't need to leave a gap. I'm going to start at this top here and sew 1/4 inch down to the bottom corner, and I'm going to stop 1/4 inch from that bottom corner. Just like I did on the last corner, I'm going to slowly stitch till I get a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt. And I'm going to leave my needle in, turn it, sew it diagonally to the corner, and cut the strings. And I'm going to repeat the process until I get around all 4 corners. Okay, now that I've sewn all the way around the perimeter, I stopped so that I have a good distance between where I started and where I ended. So now the next step is we're going to sew these 2 end pieces together, but first we're going to trim it so that they only overlap the width of the binding opened up minus 1/8 inch. So I know I've got a lot of excess on here, so I'm just going to cut off the excess that I don't need, and I'm going to use that as my measuring guide by opening it up and using that for the width of the binding. So now with these 2 overlapped, I'm going to try to center it, and then I'm going to make sure the bottom piece is trimmed up to that. So I just made sure the bottom piece was trimmed up to the top of the width. Then I'm going to put the top back over, and then I'm going to trim this so it's 1/8 less than the width of our binding when it's opened up. So I'm just going to eyeball it and go a little bit lower. Okay, so now they only overlap just about 1/8 less the width of the opened up binding. So now we're going to open these up further, hand press them so they're a little bit flatter, and then right sides together, we're going to sew these diagonally together, just like we sewed the strips of the binding together. And then I'm going to sew diagonally from the top left again down to the bottom right. Okay, now that I've got that sewn diagonally, I'm just going to trim off the excess, probably about 1/4 inch from the line. And if it helps, before sewing it, you can certainly draw a line to sew on as well. Now you notice once you trimmed it, you can press these open, and then when you kind of straighten out the quilt, that naturally lines up real nice. So you don't have a big bulky seam connection. And then I'm just going to go ahead and finish 1/4 inch sewing to sew that down. Okay, now I've got this gap all sewn down. And you can see there's very little bulk when we join the 2 ends together. And so now I'm just going to give a little finger press. You could press this with your iron too, which might be helpful. It just helps, I think, kind of stretch the binding fabric that we're going to pull over to the other edge in just a second. And then we're going to turn the binding over and onto the other side. And you want to make sure that you're going to have it go about 1/8 of an inch beyond the sewing line from when we sewed the binding down. So again, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. You can go further than that too if you like. And then this is where your binding clips come in really handy, because then you just need to put some binding clips in place to hold the binding down. And I like to do just one side of a quilt at a time. And then as I go around, I will add more binding clips. Okay, once you have it clipped, then you can go ahead and do the sewing. Before doing that, I'm just going to switch my top thread, so I'm sewing with a navy on the top, because we're going to sew right on the binding, close to the edge as we can get. And I'm going to leave my bottom thread to be a light color, just so it blends in a little bit more, because you are going to see that from the front. And hopefully if I line this up correctly and I sew close to the edge as I can get, our bottom thread should not catch the binding. It should be on the quilt itself. So I'm going to go ahead, switch my threads, and then I'll show you how I sew the rest. Okay, so I've gotten most of the binding sewn on to the first side that I was working on. But before I went on, I just wanted to show you a little bit more about sewing to the edge. So as you can see, it was right along the edge here. And you can hardly see it on the other side since I had a matching thread. And now that I'm near the corner, I also want to just show how I do the miter. So to do that, I stop again about 1/4 inch, making sure not to sew over the binding on the other side. And then I just finger press this edge, almost like you're wrapping a present, and then wrap that corner back over, finger press it again, and I'm just going to stick a binding clip there, and then I'm going to start my needle right on that corner again, and then I'm going to keep sewing down. And then I'm going to repeat that when I get to the other corners. Once you've finished sewing your binding on, go ahead and clip any extra strings you might have, and then your quilt is all finished and ready to give away or keep. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. Please subscribe if you haven't done so, and visit us at delafieldquiltco.com. Have a great day.